In the dim light of a small room, the ticking of an old clock began to echo. But this sound was not just of time passing. It was of a mystery, a secret that had been buried for years. If you think you know the whole story already, think again. Some things lie far beyond our imagination, and this tale is one of them. Are you ready to uncover the truth? Because this is not just a murder case. It's a story that will make you lose yourself with every passing moment. It was on a grey, damp Thursday morning, beneath a sky the colour of pewter and the hush of distant rain, that the village of Darnley Hollow stirred with murmurs of an unexpected departure, not of a visitor, but of Mr. Ulric Pencomb, the enigmatic old clockmaker who had lived for over 40 years above his dimly lit shop, tucked into the elbow of Hollow Street. His presence had long become part of the village's unconscious rhythm, like the slow chime of the chapel bell, or the rustle of trees in the graveyard wind. He spoke little, smiled less, and rarely ventured beyond his doorstep, save for occasional visits to the bookshop or the grocer's back counter. Most knew him only through the sound of his work, the steady tick-tick of gears aligning, the soft echo of winding springs, and the faint metallic resonance that drifted from his workshop like a heartbeat, regular, unfailing, eternal. That silence was broken on Thursday. It was young Theo Bryn, his pale, anxious apprentice, who found him, slumped at his bench as though sleep had caught him mid-thought, his spectacles still perched at the tip of his nose, and his long, ink-stained fingers frozen inches above the open chassis of a half-repaired mantel clock. A thin ribbon of cold tea ran down the edge of the table, where a porcelain cup had tipped, resting in fragments on the stone floor. The constable, a man more inclined to believe in weather patterns than foul play, declared it a natural death before the doctor had even finished examining the body. Pencomb had no immediate family, few friends, and was well into his 70s. Case closed, or so it seemed. But Miss Elspeth Holloway, a visiting relative known to the locals only as the Lady in Grey, noticed what others did not. She noticed the snap in the teacup handle was fresh, not weather-worn, not old, and that the break was clean, sharp, like something torn in haste. She noticed the drag mark along the waxed floorboards near the stairwell, faint but definite, a curved scuff that suggested something weighty had been shifted. And she noticed most curiously of all, a scent, a whisper of lavender water, delicate, unfamiliar, clinging still to the banister post and nowhere else. It was not something Alaric would have worn, nor something Theo could afford, and no visitor had been seen that day, not entering, not leaving, no footsteps, no knock, no carriage wheel, echoing on the cobbled road. Yet someone had been there. That fact hovered in the air like a question unasked. As the news of his death seeped through the village, moving slowly from the baker's wife to the grocer's clerk, to the vicar's garden boy, speculation swelled as it always did, not out of malice, but out of an almost gleeful curiosity. Had he hidden a fortune, left behind a mysterious heir? Was there a will tucked away in some secret compartment of his many ticking treasures? A few recalled vague mentions of a sister, possibly abroad, possibly dead, and some spoke of a Canadian niece no one had ever seen. The village as ever preferred to fill silence with stories. But Miss Holloway, seated near the bakery window, with her knitting untouched and her tea untouched longer, saw something else. She saw an unease rippling beneath the surface, not sorrow, not fear, but attention, the quiet anticipation that precedes revelation. 2 days later, as the fog settled low and heavy over the rooftops, the solicitor arrived. Mr. Bexley of Morn and Bexley, a disorganized man whose spectacles were perpetually askew, addressed the small crowd with a tone that attempted solemnity, but landed closer to sleepiness. No will had been located. No heir had stepped forward. Aside from a modest sum in the local bank and the property itself, the only item of significance was a peculiar grandfather clock, tall, imposing, locked from the inside, and entirely empty. No gears, no pendulum, no weights, Nothing at all. A shell. The implication landed oddly. It was a clock without time. Miss Holloway's gaze lingered on the solicitor's words. She knew, as surely as she knew the rhythm of breath or heartbeat, that Alaric Pencombe had not died alone, nor by chance. His death had not closed a chapter. It had turned the page. Something had been set in motion. Quiet, calculated, deliberate. And just like the faintest misalignment in a clock's tick, something here was not quite right. Something, or someone, had disrupted the delicate balance of time in that small forgotten shop, and now the mechanism of secrets had begun to unwind. The grandfather clock stood tall in the corner of the old apothecary's back room, its face finely etched with curling vines and celestial patterns, its mahogany frame waxed to a dull sheen. But it gave off no sound, no ticking, no rhythm, no hint of purpose. Its pendulum door was locked, and no key had ever been found, as though the clock had never been meant to be opened, nor to function at all. It had loomed there for over 50 years, largely ignored, a decorative heirloom swallowed by dust and shadows, until the sudden quiet death of its owner, Mr. Thaddeus Elric, the last in a line of reclusive herbalists in the sleepy fog-draped village of Greybridge Hollow. The locals had accepted his passing with their usual blend of respectful silence and eager whispers, but it was only when Constable Merrin, prompted by the old caretaker, forced open the clock's panel, that something shifted. Inside was no machinery, no gears, no brass, nothing but a smooth hollow interior, and a single phrase, carefully burned into the wood behind the empty clock face. Time does not hide, it watches. The moment the words were read aloud, a palpable silence spread through the room like a held breath. Mrs. Ada Ravel, a guest at the manor, and a woman whose gentle demeanor concealed a razor-sharp awareness, watched the scene unfold with a steady calm. She had seen many antiques in her time, but never one so intentionally vacant. A device built not to tell time but to defy it. It was, she quietly concluded, a container not for hours but for secrets, and that notion lingered with her longer than any of the constable's hollow reassurances. In the days that followed Elric's burial, the village began to stir in its own peculiar rhythm. Shutters opened with more caution, church pews filled with curious glances rather than prayers, and small talk twisted subtly into hushed speculation. Elric had always been an odd man, his routines tightly wound, his conversations sparse, but his departure left behind a strange echo, not of grief, but of something incomplete. Miss Vell, with her subtle observations and instinct for quiet incongruities, began to notice things: a ledger missing its final pages, an apothecary shelf meticulously organized save for one dustless gap, and a delivery box addressed not to any name, but simply to the Witness East Hollow Post. No one seemed to know what that meant, or if it had ever arrived. She listened more to the pauses in speech than the words themselves, noting which names were mentioned too quickly, and which were avoided altogether. In a village like Greybridge, where history clung to cobblestones and grudges aged like wine, silence was often louder than confession. And as she made her quiet rounds, exchanging smiles with the vicar's wife, returning a borrowed shawl to the innkeeper's niece, she came across hints of buried resentments and unresolved debts. One woman, Miss Prudence Vale, a faded beauty with the air of someone who had once been admired, but now wore elegance like armor, spoke of Elric in terms both reverent and clipped. A man of knowledge, she said, lips pursed around the word, but not of wisdom. Her manner betrayed a bitterness too carefully polished to be recent. Isadora noticed the frayed gloves she wore, the ring finger bare but indented, a life once full, now carefully concealed. Rumors thickened like mist, of an old experiment gone wrong, of a falling out between Elric and his estranged brother, who had vanished across the sea, of a rare herb stored away that could still a heartbeat in seconds. But none of it came with proof, only fragments of truth tangled in habit and memory. The grandfather clock remained where it stood, silent, inert, yet somehow heavier now, as though it were holding something unseen. And as Isadora Vell sat alone one evening near the flickering hearth of the tavern, sipping tea that had long gone cold, she realized the village itself had begun to change, not in form but in feeling, as if its very air had thickened with the weight of withheld truths. She did not speak it aloud, but she knew it now in her bones. Someone in Greybridge Hollow knew what really happened to Thaddeus Elric, and the silence of the clock was not just absence but warning. The morning after Ambrose Ryfer's sudden death, the village of Little Darnsley wore its grief like a veil, its rhythm subtly altered, not by mourning, but by a deep rippling curiosity. Miss Marple, ever observant, noticed how the gossip shifted like a slow tide, how the village, while still swaddled in its quiet commonplace existence, whispered about the peculiarities surrounding his passing. The grandfather clock, always a fixture of the Ryfer household, had captured the community's attention the most. Though it had stood in the back room of his workshop for years, silent, untouched and mostly ignored, its lack of function became an unsettling focal point after his death. When the constable, at Mr. Gibbon's behest, had opened the clock's panel, the emptiness inside seemed to mock them. There were no gears, no mechanism, no tick-tock of time, only an unnerving hollow space. Carved on the wood behind the face was a single phrase: "The truth ticks in silence." Miss Marple, standing at the edge of the room, had tilted her head ever so slightly, noting the unsettling emptiness of it. She had seen many such clocks, some broken, some decorative, but none so intentionally hollow. It was as if time itself had been deliberately kept at bay. She said nothing aloud, but the gears of her mind began to turn. Days passed, and while Little Darnsley resumed its routine, a quiet intrigue lingered. People spoke less of grief, and more of questions about Mr. Ryfer's reclusive ways, the strange occurrences in the days leading to his death, and the missing will that no one had yet to confirm existed. Miss Marple, ever attentive, had already begun her methodical observations, calling it her mental knitting. She was not one for wild suspicions but for patterns, small details hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. At the local grocer's, there was mention of Mr. Ryfer's habits, peculiarities in his routine, like a milk bottle found emptied before its usual time. At the post office, whispers of a parcel, sent abroad weeks before his death, and never spoken of since. People spoke, of course, but it was the unsaid things that Miss Marple focused on. Subtle hesitations in conversation, the fleeting glances exchanged when certain topics arose. Tamsin Ryfer, Ambrose's widow, a woman of measured grace and impeccable decorum, was another mystery. She spoke of her late husband with a cold civility, her words marked by the careful restraint of one who had long ago learned to mask emotions beneath a facade of pride. Yet, Miss Marple noticed something in her demeanor, an undercurrent of bitterness, that was not recent, but old, perhaps even festering. The clock seemed to hold some significance in Tamsin's quiet reactions, especially when it was mentioned in passing at social gatherings. Miss Marple, as always, noticed the faint flickers, things that others overlooked. Mrs. Clara Birch, a woman with sharp opinions, and a fierce sense of propriety, was another source of whispered knowledge. During a visit to her cluttered parlor, Miss Marple's gentle questions coaxed out a piece of information that sparked her interest. Clara, with the relish of one sharing a prized piece of gossip, mentioned a young woman seen entering Ryfer's workshop months before. She didn't use the front door, Clara noted with a smug smile. Came down the alley. Brown hair, about 25. Not from here, that one. Didn't speak to anyone. Miss Marple's interest was piqued, not by the woman's appearance, but by the emotion Clara had unwittingly revealed. The faintest trace of sorrow, of loss, in the mention of the woman's departure, weeks later, with her veil drawn low. Clara had noticed it too. She had tears in her eyes, she whispered, and Miss Marple had heard what was unsaid. Not just the fact of the woman's presence, but the emotion behind it. Something unspoken, something deeper. The village, with its calm and routine, was beginning to reveal its secrets. Colonel Halbert, an old military man with pride as inflexible as his posture, had lived in Little Darnsley for years. His encounters with Ambrose Ryfra few but marked by tension. A dispute over a mantel clock had once threatened to escalate into a scandal, and though the matter had never reached court, it had left a bitter residue between them. Yet, Miss Marple, who had seen such pride-driven conflicts before, knew better than to take Halbert's gruff words at face value. It was not wrath that fueled him, but wounded pride, a pride that when coupled with suspicion, could lead a man to the edge of folly. In the wake of Ambrose's death, the first murmurings of a missing will began to surface. Mrs. Pendle, with her sharp hearing, claimed she overheard Clara Birch mentioning that Ambrose had planned to set things right before the chime stopped, a phrase that sounded more like an enigmatic clue than a simple remark. Miss Marple, ever patient, understood that this phrase, like so many other fragments, held more weight than most would realize. The villagers spoke of the clock as though it were a legend, beautiful, ornate, yet silent. None could remember when it had last ticked. It had always stood as a silent witness, an object of quiet speculation. But now, with Ambrose Ryfra gone, and with all the questions surrounding his death and the missing will, the clock had become the centerpiece of the mystery, its silence perhaps a clue in itself. Miss Marple's attention was not drawn to the time-worn elegance of the grandfather clock that dominated the shop's interior, but rather to the more subtle and revealing details beneath it. Her eyes, sharp with the precision of a mind accustomed to unraveling mysteries, were fixed on the polished floorboards beneath the base. There in the gleaming wood were faint crescent-shaped scuffs that hadn't been made by the natural passage of time or the usual footfalls of the shop's visitors. No, these marks were deliberate, made by something heavier, something dragged with intent, and the arcs were fresh, too clean, and distinct against the patina of the floor. It was clear to Miss Marple that someone had moved the clock, but not just moved it in the ordinary course of events. These were not the kind of marks that could be attributed to simple wear and tear. They were far too specific, too purposeful. The clock had been shifted recently. But why? The piece had long ceased to tick, its mechanisms frozen in time, its once magnificent hands no longer tracing their circular path. Who then would exert the effort to move such a cumbersome object, and for what purpose? Miss Marple's fingers, gloved and steady, gently caressed the brass hinge of the clock. The crevice was clean, untouched by the usual layer of dust that accumulated over time. It was as though the clock had been tampered with, perhaps to hide something, or just as likely to retrieve something. Either way, it was clear the clock held secrets, and someone knew exactly where to look. As her mind turned over these possibilities, she couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was just within reach, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. It was Edwin Flett, a young man with a nervous twitch and restless energy, who first caught her attention. Under the tutelage of Mr. Ryfraftoft, the village's clockmaker, Edwin had been learning the delicate art of clock repair for several months. His obsession with precision and mechanical balance was evident to anyone who observed him for more than a moment. He was the type of young man who was often caught between eagerness and uncertainty, fumbling for words before he had even formed the thought. Miss Marple had encountered him near the parish hall one afternoon, and in her usual subtle way, she struck up a conversation with him. At first they spoke of clocks, of cogs and springs, and Edwin seemed to relax under the shared interest, his nervousness beginning to ebb away. But then Miss Marple, with her ever-sharp instincts, steered the conversation in a different direction, lightly probing the subject of the grandfather clock. As soon as she mentioned it, she noticed the shift in his demeanor. His body stiffened, his eyes flickered toward the ground, and the carefree air with which he had engaged her moments before disappeared. When she pressed him about Ambrose's involvement with the clock, Edwin's response was hesitant, stilted. He muttered something about an errand, as though desperate to end the conversation. In his hasty retreat, He dropped something, a small, intricate gear, glinting in the light as it fell from his coat pocket. Miss Marple's instincts kicked in immediately, and she stooped to pick it up once he had disappeared down the lane. She studied the gear carefully. It was no ordinary cog, its brass surface polished to perfection, its teeth sharp and unmarred by wear. On its underside, engraved with deliberate care, were two initials, RID. It wasn't merely a mechanical piece, but something deeply personal, and its sudden, unexplained appearance stirred a sense of unease in Miss Marple. She knew instinctively that this was a clue, one that would lead her deeper into a mystery that had only begun to unfold. Later, during a quiet afternoon tea at the Vicarage garden, a place Miss Marple had long favored for its peaceful ambience, and the subtle revelations it often provided, the name Millie Cartwright first entered the conversation. The topic had initially turned to old romances, as such things often did when widows gathered to share their views on the price of sugar, and reminisce about days long past. It was Mrs. Langley, the widow of the village apothecary, who lowered her voice, a glint of both mischief and pity dancing in her eyes, as she spoke of Ambrose. "Poor Ambrose," she murmured. "He was never quite the same after Millie." The story, as it emerged, was fragmented, pieces of the past unfolding like pages from an old forgotten book. Millie Cartwright had once been engaged to Ambrose Ryfraftoft, an unexpected match, many had thought. Ambrose, quiet and emotionally reserved, had seemed an unlikely match for the vivacious artistic Millie, who brought light and color to everything she touched. Despite their differences, they had been inseparable for a time, a brief but intense period, during which they seemed to have found a rhythm in one another's company. They had announced their engagement, invitations were printed, and then without any forewarning, Millie disappeared. Not in a dramatic fashion, not running off with another man or embroiled in scandal. No, it was much quieter than that. She had gone first to visit a cousin in Wiltshire, and then, over time, she simply vanished, never to be heard from again. Ambrose, for his part, had never spoken of her disappearance, nor had he explained it to anyone. He resumed his work with an almost eerie focus, throwing himself into the quiet, predictable rhythm of clockmaking, his emotions hidden behind the ticking of time. Miss Marple listened intently, stirring her tea in thoughtful silence. She had learned long ago that the absences in a person's life often held far more weight than their presence. Millie's disappearance, coupled with Ambrose's sudden withdrawal, seemed too calculated, too neatly wrapped in silence. The village had quickly forgotten her, or perhaps it was more accurate to say that they had been made to forget her. Ambrose had sealed that chapter of his life as tightly as the clock he had devoted himself to. But Miss Marple sensed that there was more to this story, hidden beneath the layers of time and dust. The disappearance wasn't what troubled her. It was the way the village had so easily accepted it, the way everyone had conspired to erase Millie from their memories. And now, with the clock's secrets and Edwin's strange behavior, she felt certain that something far deeper was at play, a mystery that stretched back through years of silence, and one that would demand to be unraveled, no matter how much time it took. Miss Marple's visit to Mr. Ryfraftoft's workshop had initially been framed as a simple errand, to collect a parasol left behind during the solicitor's inspection. But as ever, her presence had a far deeper purpose. She lingered there, her every step measured with the patience of one who knew the answers were often hidden in plain sight, waiting to be discovered by those who knew where to look. The workshop was a clutter of mechanical wonders, brass cogs, springs and tiny delicate tools neatly arranged in wooden drawers. But it wasn't the clock parts or the tools that caught her attention this time. It was the discovery of a small forgotten photograph tucked behind an old cracked leather portfolio, its edges curling with age. The image, faded and worn with time, depicted a young woman, lithe and delicate, standing with a grace that felt out of place in the present. Her features were soft, almost ethereal, and her eyes, those unmistakable eyes, were nothing short of striking. It was Millie Cartwright, no doubt about it, but the context of the photograph intrigued Miss Marple more than the subject itself. The picture showed Millie, standing beside the very grandfather clock she had once shared an intimate bond with, her hand resting lightly against its polished case, as if it were a familiar companion, waiting alongside her for time to pass. The lack of an inscription only deepened the mystery, but it was the clock that held Miss Marple's gaze. In the photograph, the door to the clock was ajar, revealing a brass pendulum in mid-swing, alive with movement, a stark contrast to the silent frozen shell of the clock in the present day. The photograph had been preserved, but not for display, only for secrecy. It confirmed what Miss Marple had long suspected. The grandfather clock had once marked more than just the passage of time. It had borne witness to emotions, to lives intertwined, to stories left untold. Someone had deliberately stopped both the clock and the emotions it represented. After slipping the photograph into her handbag for safekeeping, not to hide but to protect, Miss Marple felt the weight of this discovery settle upon her like the ticking of a clock, its rhythm both comforting and ominous. The following day, in a casual exchange with Mrs. Tamsin Refruftoft, Miss Marple mentioned Millie Cartwright's name, and the reaction was immediate, a sharp, palpable chill that seemed to freeze the very air between them. Mrs. Refruftoft's stiffening posture, the barely contained revulsion in her words, "That girl was nothing but trouble, better left forgotten," was a response one would reserve for the darkest of secrets. But it wasn't the words themselves that piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. It was the fierce, unguarded resentment beneath them. Mrs. Refruftoft, with her composure and sharp tongue, had not only spoken from a place of bitterness, but from a place of fear. A fear of what Millie represented, a disruption to the order, to the control that Tamsin clung to so desperately. In Miss Marple's experience, those who feared the past most were often those who had the most to lose from it being uncovered. Tamsin's icy reaction spoke volumes, revealing more than just disdain. It was a fear that the past, with all its messy emotions and unresolved tensions, would resurface, threatening her carefully constructed world. What puzzled Miss Marple, however, was the unmistakable undercurrent of something more personal. Tamsin's need to assert her authority over Ambrose's affections, or failing that, over his legacy. Millie had been loved, and Tamsin had known it. Miss Marple knew well that bitterness often stemmed from comparison, from the gnawing ache of feeling second best, and in Tamsin's cold tone, she could hear the sting of envy, sharp and brittle with age. Edwin Flett, the young apprentice under Ambrose's tutelage, had always struck Miss Marple as an anxious soul, nervously fidgeting with his hands, eyes constantly shifting, as though he were afraid of what he might reveal. He had worked alongside Ambrose for nearly 2 years, a dutiful but timid lad, whose silence was often misinterpreted as simplicity. Yet Miss Marple knew that those who remained quiet often observed the most. In a conversation that seemed more like a gentle reminiscence than an interrogation, Edwin confessed something that made the hairs on the back of Miss Marple's neck stand on end. Months ago Ambrose had asked him to assist in making modifications to the base of the grandfather clock, an unusual request, not for a routine repair, but something far more deliberate. It had been Edwin, the ever-loyal and ever-silent assistant, who had noticed it. The clock's base had been tampered with, altered in a way that could only be described as intentional, a manipulation of its very structure. The modifications were subtle but deliberate, designed to stop the clock not merely in its ticking but in its essence, in its life. There had been no accident, no mistake. This had been planned. What then had Ambrose been trying to conceal, or worse yet trying to preserve? Miss Marple's thoughts swirled with possibilities as she pieced together these fragments. Ambrose's obsession with the clock, Edwin's reluctant confession, the photograph of Millie, and Tamsin's icy reaction. All these clues pointed toward a hidden history, one that ran deep, tangled with secrets that had been locked away and covered up. And Miss Marple, with her quiet determination and acute perception, knew that the key to unraveling this tangled web lay within the walls of the Refruftoft workshop, where time had been both stopped and kept alive, hidden in the most unlikely of places. Miss Marple had always approached her investigations with a peculiar grace, like a breeze slipping through a crack, unnoticed until it had already shifted the air. On a cloudy afternoon, she returned to the workshop of the late Mr. Ambrose Refraftoft, ostensibly to retrieve a parasol she had left behind during a previous visit. Yet her true purpose was not so easily explained. The place still reeked of an unspoken history, familiar and oddly uninviting. As she stepped across the creaking floorboards, her hands brushed over the delicate brass cogs and scattered keys, her fingers grazing over what others might dismiss as mundane clutter. It was here, behind a seemingly random stack of old ledger books, that she found it, a photograph, weathered by time, its edges curling like the hands of an old clock, its gloss faded to a memory. The picture was of a young woman, strikingly similar to the descriptions Mrs. Langley had provided, light-featured, slender, dressed in a style that suggested an era long past. She stood next to the very grandfather clock that had loomed in the shop, her hand resting on it as though it had been an intimate companion for years. There was no name written, but Miss Marple saw what was unmistakable. The resemblance to Millie Cartwright was undeniable, yet the photograph was hidden, tucked away in the shadows, as though it was never meant to be seen. What caught her attention more than anything was the clock itself. In the photograph, it was alive with motion, its brass pendulum swinging in perfect time, a heartbeat of sorts for the quiet room. Yet now, here it sat still, a hollow shell of its former self, its silence betraying a secret buried deep within. Miss Marple's mind clicked like one of the very gears she had just examined. She knew something had been concealed within the timepiece. Someone had intentionally stopped the passage of time, and with it the truth. As she moved to leave, she couldn't help but think of how perfectly the clock's silence mirrored the mystery surrounding it, and the people desperate to keep it buried. The next conversation she had with Tamsin Refraftoft was as cold as the air outside the shop. When Miss Marple casually mentioned Millie Cartwright, a flicker of something flashed across Tamsin's face, something sharp, unmistakable. Her lips tightened, and her eyes darkened, as if the mere mention of Millie had sent an electric shock through her composure. That girl, Tamsin spat, her voice strained with years of resentment, was nothing but trouble. Better left forgotten. Miss Marple had seen it before, the way the past clung to those who had something to lose. Tamsin's sharp tone was not born of indifference, but of a fear of being overshadowed, of something being torn away that she could not control. She had once vied for Ambrose's affections, a woman desperate for his love, only to have Millie take it from her. Tamsin's words were an armor, but Miss Marple could see the cracks in it, a bitterness, yes, but one that came from envy, a deep ache of comparison that had only hardened over the years. Meanwhile, Edwin Flett, the nervous young assistant, was an open book, if one knew how to read the spaces between his words. Timid, but observant, Edwin had been under Ambrose's employ for just over a year, working late hours, often with no one but the ticking of the clocks for company. It was during one of their quiet conversations, framed not as an interrogation but as a simple exchange of memories, that Edwin revealed a strange detail. Ambrose had once asked him to assist with modifications to the base of the grandfather clock, something that was never mentioned to anyone else. Ambrose had worked on it only after hours, and strangely had sworn Edwin to secrecy. It wasn't a repair, Edwin said, but a secret compartment built into the clock, carefully hidden beneath a false panel. It wasn't a mechanism or a tool Ambrose had hidden away. It was something far more precious. Memory. Something handwritten, something important, something to be kept safe. When Ambrose had sealed it, Edwin had no idea what it was, only that it had been hidden with reverence. Now, after Ambrose's death, the clock sat in silence, its secrets buried within it. Miss Marple, with the patient expertise only she possessed, returned to the clock. She did not make a show of it, merely tracing the woodwork with her fingers, feeling for the subtle changes beneath the surface. Eventually her touch landed on a seam where there should have been none. Pressing it carefully, the false panel shifted, revealing not a will, but a single folded sheet of paper. It was worn, its creases deep with age, but the handwriting was unmistakably Ambrose's, precise, almost clinical in its clarity. The words on the paper read, "When the chime is silent, the truth begins." Miss Marple felt a chill run down her spine as she folded the note back into its hiding place. It wasn't an answer. It was a riddle, a cryptic message, designed for someone who understood the significance of silence. Ambrose had built time for everyone else, but his own secrets had remained locked away, sealed in the very heart of the clock he had crafted with such care. Later that night, the village of Little Darnsley was shaken by an uncharacteristic break-in at the clock shop. It wasn't the sort of crime the village was used to. There were no stolen trinkets, no petty thefts. Instead, clocks had been smashed, their glass faces shattered, and their delicate mechanisms ruined. The only one left untouched was the grandfather clock. Its varnished surface remained pristine, not even a fingerprint on it. Miss Marple arrived just after the constable had finished his preliminary report, and as always, she asked nothing directly, but her sharp eye caught the details others might miss: the clean sweep of glass shards into the corner, and the peculiar absence of dust near the base of the clock, as though someone had recently knelt there in desperation. It was not the work of a thief. It was the frantic, desperate act of someone who had been searching for something specific, something they feared had already been discovered. And so, as the village buzzed with theories, Miss Marple's mind turned to one question: who had broken in not to steal, but to ensure that the secret, whatever it was, stayed hidden? There were unsettling details that slipped past the surface of the ordinary, like the fireplace poker, a heavy iron tool with an intricately polished handle, now missing, though the fire had never been lit. Even more curious was the disappearance of Clara Birch's diary, a constant companion she'd been known to write in obsessively, recording every moment of her life with punctilious care. Not a single volume, old or new, could be found. Miss Marple, always so keen on the nuances of human nature, did not display surprise, but rather a quiet sense of solemn resignation. Clara had been, in many ways, a keeper of inconvenient truths, a collector of memories, both private and public, that others preferred buried. Yet, Miss Marple, ever the observer, had long harbored a quiet appreciation for Clara's unrelenting curiosity. Those who watched often stored the most dangerous truths. Now Clara's own story had been halted abruptly, but it was the absence of the diary that held Miss Marple's attention. It wasn't just the missing pages, it was the deliberate silence someone had imposed on them. Whoever had taken Clara's life had done so not for what she had done, but for what she had remembered. A chilling realization that the truth was drawing ever closer. Only a day before her death, Clara had come to Miss Marple with a peculiar sense of urgency, a quiet whisper over tea. She had confessed with an odd glint in her eye that something about the girl in the photograph had returned to her, a piece of memory that had been lost but now surfaced again. She couldn't explain it fully, but her words held weight, a connection she had almost uncovered. She said she needed to check her old notes first, but those notes never came, and whatever revelation Clara had been on the brink of discovering had died with her. The girl in the photograph, the faded image of Millie Cartwright, beside the grandfather clock, remained an enigma, one that Clara had been drawn to, but never fully understood. Miss Marple, ever attuned to such moments, immediately recognized the significance of Clara's words, and the eerie coincidence of her death, mere hours after speaking them. It was as if someone had recognized that Clara knew too much, and had silenced her forever. Miss Marple's investigation led her to Clara's home the morning after her passing, where she was tasked with helping sort through her belongings. The scene was almost too perfect, too curated. The parlor, typically cluttered with half-read magazines and cluttered shelves, had been meticulously tidied. A second teacup sat, untouched, beside a tray, and the rug was perfectly aligned with the edges of the room. It was clear that Clara had been expecting someone, preparing for a conversation that would never take place. The missing diary, which she had likely planned to share, was nowhere to be found, leaving a silence where once there had been intent. Miss Marple traced the edge of the chair, where Clara had always sat, a half-smile lingering on her lips, forever anticipating the next great revelation. But this time, the anticipation had been her undoing. Someone had come, not for a simple chat, but to silence her permanently. The forceful outrage of Colonel Halbert, who had spoken at length of swift justice, only seemed to deepen the mystery. His vocal concern strangely theatrical, in light of the circumstances, drawing Miss Marple's suspicion even further. Someone had been in Clara's life, not just to remove a memory, but to bury an entire truth, a truth she had come far too close to uncovering. Miss Marple, with her unshakable calm, now knew with certainty that the murder was not about vengeance or rage. It was about what Clara had known, and the dangerous knowledge she had been on the verge of exposing. Miss Marple's intuition had long taught her that beneath the bluster and the noise, there often lay the quiet tremor of guilt, and Colonel Halbert, with all his proclamations of justice, was no exception. His indignation, though fiery and vocal, had the unmistakable sting of someone trying too hard to appear innocent. It was well known that on the night of Clara Birch's death, the Colonel had claimed to be at home nursing a sore ankle, perusing old issues of the Field. But as ever, Miss Marple noticed the fine threads of inconsistency in his story. There had been no one to corroborate his alibi, but that wasn't altogether surprising. The Colonel was a solitary man by choice, engaging only in the most superficial village activities, perhaps the occasional gun club gathering, or a stilted conversation at the village fete. Yet it was his boots that now held Miss Marple's attention. On a recent evening walk near Clara's cottage, she had come across distinct, military-issue bootprints by the parlor window. The heel was deeply marked with a notch, the very same indent present in the polished boots that the Colonel was known to favor. The discovery, subtle but telling, had confirmed something Miss Marple had suspected, but had not yet spoken aloud. She had made a note of it, in the quiet folds of her mind, knowing well that a man so desperate to raise his voice against suspicion often sought only to deflect attention from his own wrongdoing. There was more, too. She remembered a bitter legal dispute between Halbert and Ambrose Ryfraftoft many years ago. A quarrel over a faulty racing wager. Small things, perhaps, but they held weight in a village like St. Mary Mead, where every action resonated. But Miss Marple, ever patient, did not rush to conclusions. Instead, she observed. The next day, during a casual stroll with Edwin, she picked up a fragment of knowledge that shifted the weight of the mystery even further. Edwin, as ever, had been nervy and uncertain, but in his nervousness, he had let slip a detail of significance. Clara Birch had once been a close friend to Millie Cartwright, a fact Miss Marple had never heard before. Edwin explained that Clara had lent him a letter to copy years ago, a letter addressed to Dearest M. The letter had spoken of a love lost, regrets held tight, and a friendship shattered by a betrayal, all shrouded in silence. Clara had believed, to the very core of her being, that Ambrose had wronged Millie, not out of malice, but out of cowardice, and though time had dulled the pain, the bitterness Clara felt toward Ambrose had never truly gone away. Miss Marple walked with this new understanding, pondering the loyalty Clara had held for her long-lost friend, a loyalty that had perhaps cost her more than she realized. Later, as Miss Marple meandered through the overgrown garden behind the clock shop, a small disturbance in the soil caught her trained eye. She bent low, her fingers brushing against a freshly staked rosebush, and there, nestled beneath the earth, she unearthed a silver pocket watch. The chain was broken, the casing tarnished by years of neglect, but what caught her attention was the faint, unmistakable smear of dried blood at the hinge. No initials, no markings, just a quiet damning artifact, as if someone had tried to bury a memory in haste. The watch was not a murder weapon, but it was something more, a message, something deliberately hidden. Miss Marple held the watch in her gloved hand, considering the weight of the story it might tell. A story interrupted, perhaps by the silence of those too ashamed to speak it aloud. As she placed the watch back into her bag, The pieces of the puzzle slowly began to assemble, not in grand revelations, but in the quiet echoes of small choices made behind closed doors. Time, she realized, had been speaking all along. It wasn't hidden in the drawers of legal records, or safely locked away. The answers were waiting in the spaces between words, in the unspoken silences that stretched like shadows, beneath the surface of the village's seemingly placid existence. In the quiet, unassuming village of Little Darnsley, where time seemed to pass as slowly as the murmurs of its inhabitants, secrets lingered like fog in the valley, thick and unseen. Yet it was behind the ancient grandfather clock, an enduring symbol of the village's past, where Miss Marple knew the heart of the mystery lay. The clock, long disassembled, had been stripped of its workings, and left abandoned, a relic that had yet to reveal its true nature to those who had dared to try and pry into its silence. But Miss Marple, with her unrivaled patience and careful mind, had long suspected that the most significant truths were never where people assumed they would be, especially when guilt or shame had been allowed to fester beneath the surface. She knew that time itself, much like people, often held its secrets close until the right moment arrived. The clock tower had, for months, been a riddle that taunted the villagers, offering no answers, only deeper questions. But Miss Marple, with the key pieces of the puzzle now in her hands, Edwin's cryptic confession and the cryptic letter penned by Ambrose himself, approached the clock one final time. She understood something that others might have missed. The clock wasn't merely a timepiece. It was a vessel of memory, a repository of regret, and if you knew how to listen, it would speak to you in its own way. Her hands, deft and sure, moved with precision over the wood of the clock's inner casing, her fingers tracing the delicate contours that held the secrets of the past. After a moment of tense stillness, the mechanism released with a soft protest, wood against brass, and she carefully pried open the hidden compartment. Inside, tucked away as though it were a precious artifact, lay a small yellowed envelope. Its edges were brittle with age, and the twine that bound it had faded from countless years of neglect. But for Miss Marple, every detail was a clue, every forgotten thing a whisper in the dark. She knew that this envelope, though seemingly inconsequential, held the answer to a story that had been buried for far too long. She unfurled it with the kind of reverence reserved for important discoveries, her sharp eyes skimming the contents with practiced ease. The handwriting was unmistakably Ambrose Ryfraftoft's, rigid, formal, cautious. Even in his final moments, the man had been emotionally distant, leaving nothing to chance, nothing unspoken, but his hand still betrayed the gravity of the truth that lay within. The document was his last will and testament, dated just 3 months before his death. But as Miss Marple's eyes traveled down the page, it wasn't the mundane details of property or estate that captured her attention. It was the name, Amelia Carter, the name that seemed foreign to most, but not to Miss Marple. It was a name she had heard before, whispered in passing by Clara Birch, a name that had surfaced in a letter from the vicar's wife, strangely familiar, yet so completely unexpected. Amelia Carter, the sole heir to Ambrose's considerable estate. The villagers had never known of her, nor had they ever suspected that such a person existed. She had appeared suddenly, quietly, staying under an assumed name, asking no questions, making no noise. The village had ignored her as it so often did, failing to notice the significance of the woman who had come to ask questions about a past long buried in the shadows of secrecy. But Miss Marple had noticed. She had pieced together the puzzle with the subtlety only she could master. Amelia had arrived weeks before Ambrose's death, staying in a modest room above the stationer's shop, writing notes in a small leather-bound book, seeking the truth of her mother's past. Miss Marple recalled how Amelia had made no demands, how she hadn't come seeking wealth or a place in the social order of the village. She had come quietly, a woman in search of the pieces of her history. She had come, as Miss Marple understood, to uncover the silence that had shrouded her birth. Why had her mother, Millie Cartwright, disappeared without a trace? Why had her name been erased, hidden from the very fabric of the village's memory? It was not a confrontation Amelia had come for, Miss Marple realized, It was simply acknowledgement. Ambrose, for all his faults and failures, had known of Amelia's existence. He had not turned her away. Perhaps, moved by the striking resemblance between Amelia and Milly, or perhaps stirred by the guilt that had haunted him for years, he had chosen to reveal the truth at last, not in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but in the most intimate way possible, by naming Amelia as his heir. The will Miss Marple held in her hands was not just a legal document. It was a confession. It was Ambrose's final attempt to atone for the years of silence, for the cowardice that had defined his relationship with Milly, and for the child he had abandoned. It was a fragile hope that perhaps, after all these years, the truth would finally be allowed to breathe. Little Darnsley, with its quiet lanes and whispering trees, had long buried its secrets beneath a veneer of politeness and civility. But the past, as Miss Marple knew too well, is never truly buried. It waits, patient, until the time is right. And now, in the stillness of the clock shop, the past had returned, not in vengeance, but in fragile hope. Ambrose, in his final moments, had not sought to bury the truth any longer. Instead, he had allowed it to surface, not with a clamor, but with a whisper that Miss Marple had finally heard. And as the clock ticked on, its timepiece now fully revealed, Miss Marple knew the truth would soon speak louder than any tick or tock ever could. Time, once silenced, had begun again. In the heart of Little Darnsley, beneath the carefully preserved tranquility of the village, a dark truth began to surface, carried by the weight of years of hidden regret. Ambrose Ryfreftoft, a man whose life had been defined by silence, had at long last made an attempt to confront the past she had so skillfully buried, his guilt pressing against him like the relentless ticking of the grandfather clock that had stood in his home for decades, now silent, but still a haunting reminder. His confession had not come with dramatic proclamations or public spectacle. Instead, it had been whispered in the pages of a letter, one intended only for his own eyes. The letter, marked with an unusual, more fluid handwriting, revealed his deep shame, not in the language of apology, but in the quiet, self-inflicted torment of a man who had made a decision long ago that now gnawed at his conscience. He confessed, in somber words, how he had turned Milly Cartwright away when she had come to him, pregnant and desperate. Her plea had been met not with compassion, but with the cold practicality of a man worried more about family reputation than the life of the woman standing before him. His elder brother Tamsin's influence had steered him toward a decision that had torn his heart. He had denied Milly the refuge she so desperately needed. Now, years later, the guilt of that choice had consumed him, and the very ticking of time that had once comforted him had transformed into an incessant accusation. Ambrose had sought out Amelia, Milly's daughter, in a futile attempt to make amends, but by then, time had already passed, and the wounds of the past could not be so easily healed. Miss Marple, having learned of this revelation, also sensed that Amelia's arrival in the village had done more than merely stir old memories. It had reignited fear in the hearts of those who had buried their own secrets, and with that fear, a dangerous tension hung thick in the air. The night Miss Marple had called the quiet gathering in the Ryfreftoft drawing room, there had been no fanfare, no grand declarations, only a soft and deliberate invitation extended to those whose lives were intricately woven into the fabric of this long-hidden tale. Mrs. Tamsin Ryfreftoft had arrived first, her expression composed, but her eyes betraying an edge of anxiety. Colonel Halbert, always certain in his posture, moved with a military precision, though his words were always cautious and few. Edwin Flett, nervous and pale, shifted uncomfortably, his hands twisted into nervous knots, as though the very air in the room suffocated him. Lastly, Mr. Gibbons, the solicitor, sat hesitantly, clutching a folder in his lap, unsure of what to expect from the proceedings. As the gathering settled into an expectant silence, Miss Marple's soft voice broke the stillness, not with accusations, but with the calm clarity of a woman who knew that truth, when given space, always found its way to the surface. She spoke of the recent weeks leading up to Ambrose's death, the strange activity in his life, the letters he had written, and the changes he had made to the grandfather clock, a final attempt to set right what had long been left to fester. Edwin, with a tremor in his voice, confirmed the peculiarities of Ambrose's behavior, noting that the man had seemed withdrawn, preoccupied, as if he were preparing for a final reckoning. Miss Marple then turned to the mention of Amelia, the quiet, mysterious newcomer, who had arrived in the village under the shadow of Ambrose's passing, and who had in the weeks before his death, met with him in private. It was no coincidence that a revised will, discovered hidden within the hollow of the clock, had surfaced just at the time of Amelia's arrival, a final twist of fate. Miss Marple then referenced Clara Birch's cryptic final words, just before her untimely death, how she had mentioned something about the girl in the photograph, a connection that had been long buried but now stirred, rippling through the veins of this once peaceful village. As Miss Marple delicately placed the will and Ambrose's personal letter on the table, the weight of those objects did not go unnoticed by all present, but the silence that followed was one of deep recognition, a silence that spoke volumes. Miss Marple, with her usual subtlety, refrained from outright accusations, yet it was clear to those gathered that the past, long buried under layers of polite conversation and hidden truths, had come rushing back, and its consequences were far from over. As the clock ticked, its hands now steady, it was clear to Miss Marple that time had caught up with all of them, and now, the truth would be forced to stand in the light, whether they were ready or not. In the quiet, dimly lit drawing room, the air was thick with an unspoken tension, the kind that seems to settle into the very fabric of a place long after the echoes of words have faded. The old house, with its crumbling wallpaper and the faint scent of dust, had witnessed countless secrets over the years. Now in this moment, it was bearing witness to another, the culmination of years of deception, fear, and buried guilt. Miss Marple sat still, her presence serene yet commanding, as if time itself had paused to listen to her every word. The others were gathered around her, each one drawn into the web she had silently spun, none more aware than they of the trap closing in. The air hung heavy with their collective unease, their eyes flickering nervously from the faint broken clock on the mantelpiece to the small pile of objects Miss Marple had placed before them, the will, the photograph of Millie Cartwright, and the letter in Ambrose Rifer's own handwriting. These were the artifacts of a life, or rather the life of a man who had tried desperately to bury his past, and in doing so, had invited the present to rise up and confront him. The clock, once a symbol of precision and order, now stood as a mute but damning reminder of a man who had feared the passage of time more than most. Miss Marple's voice, though soft, cut through the quiet like a blade, each word deliberate, measured, and yet imbued with an almost unspoken certainty. "It was not time that broke this clock," she said, her gaze flickering momentarily towards the figure of Tamin Rifer, whose poised exterior barely concealed the tremor of guilt stirring beneath. "It was intention. The intention to erase the past, to cover it with layers of lies and misdirection, hoping that the truth would fade into the shadows like so many others before it." The weight of her words settled into the room like a slow, creeping fog, and for a moment, none of them dared to breathe. Miss Marple's eyes moved around the room, lingering on each individual, observing their every subtle shift of discomfort. Colonel Halbert, ever the stoic figure, shifted in his seat, his muddy bootprints matching the faint marks Miss Marple had discovered beneath Clara's window. The pattern was as clear as a confession to her trained eye, yet she made no accusation. Not yet. Instead she turned to Tamin, whose eyes, though outwardly calm, darted anxiously between the will and the letter. Miss Marple's voice softened as she continued, almost as though speaking to herself. Ambrose was a man who valued reputation above all. He lived in the shadow of what he feared would be lost. The legacy of his name, the remnants of his family's status. But then came Amelia. The name lingered in the air like a forbidden word, one that had opened the floodgates of fear and chaos. A stranger, a woman with no fortune, no lineage. She arrived uninvited, And in her wake, everything Ambrose had carefully constructed began to unravel. His legacy, his pride, everything he had worked to protect, was threatened by a simple truth: Amelia's existence. Tamin's face remained unreadable, but her lips pressed together in a thin line, betraying a tension that even she couldn't fully suppress. Miss Marple observed this with a knowing glance, for she understood the heart of the matter better than anyone else in the room. When Ambrose died, you believed you could control the narrative. You thought that the scandal would remain buried, that no one would ever speak of Millie, of the child. But Clara remembered. Clara saw Amelia and knew too much. She became a threat, one you could not afford. Miss Marple paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. So you visited her, pretended civility, but beneath that politeness, there was a darker intent to silence her, to make sure no one would ever know the truth. The room held its breath, the silence stretching long and uncomfortable. Even Tamin, who had been so composed up until this moment, could not hide the flicker of unease that crossed her features. She did not speak, but the tremor in her hand as it reached for the glass of water at her side spoke volumes. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. You didn't kill from hatred, Tamin. You killed out of fear. Fear of losing everything. The only thing that mattered to you. Your name. Your position. Your place in this world. The clocks in this house, they tell time. Yes, but more than that, they remind you of the moments you've tried to forget. Her voice softened, as though speaking with a strange kind of sympathy, yet still unrelenting. You tried to bury your guilt, but it wouldn't stay buried. It has a way of finding its way back, like a ticking clock that refuses to stop. Tamin's face remained an unreadable mask, but the air around her had changed. The truth had been laid bare, and with it, the walls she had so carefully built around her began to crumble. Miss Marple, ever the calm and deliberate observer, continued, her voice now taking on a quiet certainty. The method, Tamin, was simple, so simple that no one would have suspected. Ambrose, a man fragile in both body and reputation, trusted you enough to accept your kindness, your tea. But in that tea, you slipped digitalis, enough to steal the heart of a man already on the edge, yet not enough to leave a trace, a death so quiet, so subtle, that it would appear nothing more than the natural end of a man who had lived too long in his own memories. The room seemed to exhale in unison, the truth settling like dust upon old furniture. But even then, it wasn't the poison that had betrayed Tamin, it was the aftermath. The frantic search through the house, the turning over of ledgers, the frantic opening of drawers. And then in the quiet of that final day, the will hidden away in the hollow of the clock, remained just out of reach. But Tamin, in her desperation, moved the clock, unaware of the faint trail she left behind. A scratch, a smudge, a tiny shift in the symmetry of the room that Miss Marple's sharp eyes could not miss. Do you think you could erase the past so easily? Miss Marple asked softly, her gaze never leaving Tamin's. Do you think you could bury the truth beneath the dust of this house, under layers of deception and fear? Tamin's silence was all the answer Miss Marple needed. The truth, she knew, had its own rhythm, and even when time itself had been manipulated, the echo of guilt could never be silenced for long. The ticking of the clock had stopped, but its echo would reverberate through the years, a constant reminder that the past always finds a way to resurface, no matter how carefully it is hidden. In the thick silence of the room, the tension between them was palpable, an invisible thread, pulling tighter with every passing second. Tamin, whose composure had always been a mask of calculated grace, now stood alone in the dim-lit parlor. Clara, ever the trusting soul, had expected a conversation, a simple exchange of words. Instead, she found herself with a visitor bearing a far darker purpose. The poison, hidden beneath the guise of civility, slipped quietly into Clara's veins, leaving her with nothing but the heavy weight of inevitability in her fading breath. Yet the act was not done with ease. Tamin knew she could not simply leave. She had to erase any trace of the chaos that had unfolded, to mask the true nature of the crime. And so she did what came naturally. She took Clara's diary, a record that had likely captured far too much, the sharp inconvenient truths that would unravel everything. The poker, once an instrument of defense, was now an accomplice in her meticulousness, used not to protect, but to remove any potential evidence from the parlor, leaving it unnervingly pristine, unnaturally ordered. Fear, however, clung to the room like a third presence, unnoticed but felt. Clara's death had not silenced the questions. It had only magnified them. With the villagers growing more suspicious, more drawn into the quiet puzzle of the past, Tammin turned to misdirection. She had to stir up confusion, make it appear as if something far less sinister was afoot. So under the cover of night, she broke into the clock shop, her movements swift and frantic. She shattered timepieces, overturned drawers, and scattered tools in a violent dance of destruction. She hoped it would create a tale of a crime born of petty theft or revenge. But there, untouched by her frenzy, stood the grandfather clock, a towering relic of time's unyielding nature. Perhaps it was fear that kept her from breaking it, or perhaps she understood that this particular clock had already revealed its own secrets. Still, the damage was done. The false disorder was set in place, but Miss Marple, with her keen sense for deceit, saw through it like glass. She knew that chaos was often just a well-placed illusion, a carefully constructed veil to hide the truth. And when the constable and his men arrived, the bloodied pocket watch, the symbol of a life once thought lost, was unearthed behind the flower bed, its significance clear even before the initials were fully read. It had been Milly's, a gift from Ambrose, long hidden and forgotten, a relic of a romance buried beneath years of regret. Edwin, sorting through forgotten relics, had stumbled upon it, sensing its weight but not its meaning. But when Ambrose realized the will had vanished, he buried it, not to discard it, but to preserve it, to hold on to something that had slipped away in the chaos of his past. And Tammin, after his death, had found it again, clutching it in her hands, hoping it would reveal more, lead her to greater truths. But instead, it led her to blood on her gloves, on the watch's casing, on her own conscience. She could hide the diary, she could erase the clues, but she could not erase what was already stained. The truth, like the watch, had stopped ticking, but it had not vanished. It had only waited, waiting for the right moment to resurface. When the constable arrived, Tammin offered no resistance, no protest. She was a woman who had long since abandoned the hope of redemption. She stood, poised and calm, as if the weight of the past had already been dealt with in her mind. There was no rage, no tears, only a quiet acceptance, as though she had made her peace with the inevitable. And when Miss Marple observed her, she did not see the collapse of a woman shattered by guilt. No, what Miss Marple saw was a woman who had long chosen pride over truth, whose dignity was all that remained. Tammin's eyes, for a brief moment, flickered not towards the clock shop or the house, but towards the unbloomed rosebush at the back of the garden, where a pocket watch had been buried, a symbol of regret that could never be fully concealed. Miss Marple did not speak as Tammin was taken away. There was no need. The moment did not demand commentary, for it had already spoken its own language. As the constable tipped his hat, Miss Marple nodded in quiet understanding, as though the events that had unfolded were not a dramatic climax, but a long-awaited resolution. Time had come for Tammin, as it always does for those who live too long in the shadows of their past. Meanwhile, Amelia Carter, having received the solicitor's formal notice, accepted it with a quiet dignity. She did not linger, did not allow herself to be overtaken by sentiment or drama. She had seen too much, felt too much, to be swayed by the superficial. She was not here to mourn or to act. She was here only to move forward, as the past was already behind her, its weight already lifted from her shoulders. The story, it seemed, had reached its end, and all that remained was the passing of time itself. As the village of Darnsley returned to its quiet rhythm, a sense of unease lingered like the scent of rain yet to fall. The house, once filled with the secrets of its inhabitants, stood empty, its clocks no longer ticking with the same cadence that had governed the years of its twisted history. The events of the past weeks, unsaid words, fractured promises, and lives altered forever, were now bound to paper, neatly tucked into the folds of the solicitor's office. But even as Amelia Carter quietly gathered her belongings, the key to the clock shop pressed into her palm like a bitter relic, it was clear that her mind had already drifted far from the place that had never quite welcomed her. The village, with its overgrown hedges and winding paths, had answered all the questions she had once carried like stones in her pockets, but it had not given her the peace she sought. As she prepared to leave behind the house and its shadowed memories, she could not escape the feeling that time, like the hands of the very clocks that had marked every hour, was closing in on her. Miss Marple, ever the observer, had already seen the subtle shifts in Amelia's demeanor, the quiet retreat of a woman who, though outwardly composed, was driven by something deeper, something that clung to the fabric of her being like the scent of roses still refusing to bloom. The letter Amelia left behind was as brief as it was telling. No emotional outpouring, no tears, only a photograph of Millie beside the old grandfather clock, its face frozen in time. "I think she would have liked you," it said, the ink faint but steady. It was a farewell, not of finality, but of a long inevitable departure, the kind of departure one makes when they no longer belong to the place they inhabit. On the morning after Amelia's departure, Miss Marple wandered through the garden, her basket gently swaying in her hand, the scent of the half-bloomed roses thick in the air. The soil beneath her feet had been disturbed, freshly turned, as if to bury the past, yet no amount of replanting could erase the truth. There behind the flower-bed, the signs of a burial remained, though now carefully concealed beneath the new mulch. Memory, Miss Marple knew, was not so easily hidden. The ripples of truth had already spread through Darnsley, and now the villagers, with their lives redefined, moved like ghosts through a house once full of echoes. Some whispered of Tamsin, painting her as either a tragic victim or a ruthless tyrant, depending on which side of her temper had been felt. But Miss Marple did not concern herself with such judgments. She thought instead of the intricacies of guilt, how it did not always arrive with the violence of passion, but in the quiet whispered silences we choose to keep. Her thoughts turned to clocks, those ever-present symbols of time's passage. They ticked, hour by hour, unnoticed, until the moment they stopped, and in that stillness, the weight of everything unsaid settled into the air. Time, Miss Marple mused, had its own secrets, some whispered quietly into the night, others waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal themselves. As the afternoon wore on, and the vicar's wife arrived with a sponge cake and conversation that drifted like the breeze, on topics so mundane, that even the mention of postal delays seemed like a break from the heavier truths, the village seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Yet beneath the surface, something had shifted. The rhythms of their lives, once uninterrupted, now carried with them a weight that had not been there before. As she poured the tea, Miss Marple reflected on what had passed, not with a sense of justice, but of understanding. Tamsin had sought to escape her past, Clara had clung to a memory that no longer fit the present, and Ambrose, always too late, had mourned what he had lost. But Amelia, quiet, persistent Amelia, had emerged not as a victor, but as someone who had found the peace the others had sought in vain. As the vicar's wife took another slice of cake, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the photograph Amelia had left behind. Millie's gaze, half turned away from the camera, seemed to seek something beyond the frame, her truth not yet fully understood. "It is curious," Miss Marple murmured to herself, her voice almost lost beneath the ticking of the clock. "How many secrets tick away just beyond our reach?" And as the clock struck 4, the sound rang out clear, marking not an end, but the quiet beginning of yet another story waiting to unfold. The clock, once stilled by the weight of secrets and unspoken words, now sat quietly, its hands no longer frozen in time, but moving with a new, almost imperceptible rhythm. This was no longer the silence of things buried deep, locked away for fear of exposure, but a silence born of understanding, of truth finally having the space to breathe. In the small village of Little Darnsley, where gossip lingered like morning mist, and every face seemed to hold a secret, the clock's tick once again marked the passage of time, not just on the hour, but on the years of careful lies, silent regrets, and hidden truths that had finally emerged from the shadows. It wasn't merely a tale of a tragic murder, or an inheritance lost and found. Nor was it about a watch whose hands had been stained by a darker past. It was something deeper, something more subtle. It was the story of lives shaped by choices, both big and small, made to conceal, to protect, to forget, and how those decisions, no matter how carefully crafted, leave an indelible mark on the lives of others. Ambrose, forever haunted by the ghosts of his past, had tried to atone for his mistakes, but the weight of his remorse had come too late. His desperate attempts to mend what could not be undone were a reminder that some wounds once inflicted can never fully heal. Tamsin, whose name had carried with it so much promise, had clung to a past that never gave her the love she so desperately sought. Her grip on a false hope left her adrift, unfulfilled, forever haunted by the emptiness of a life lived in pursuit of a love that was always just out of reach. Clara, too, had been a prisoner of memory, those fleeting moments she could never let go of, the ones twisted by fear and loss, those memories now her only companions in a life lived in the shadow of what was never allowed to be. And yet, in the midst of all this, it was not the dramatic revelations or the rush of justice that left the most lasting impression. It was the moment of quiet reflection, the stillness in the garden, as Miss Marple stood alone, pondering the fragile nature of truth. It wasn't in the loud confession or the dramatic court scene, but in the soft murmur of understanding, the realization that some secrets, those small, seemingly insignificant whispers, do not cry out to be heard. They wait, quietly ticking away in the background, until someone comes along with the patience to listen, to understand, and to unravel the deeper layers hidden beneath. It was this realization that struck Miss Marple, as she stood there, contemplating the quiet power of truth. Some secrets, she had once remarked, tick away unnoticed, waiting for someone with the wisdom to hear them. And that, Miss Marple understood, was the real key, hearing the unspoken, listening to the silence, and finding meaning in the spaces between the words. The clock now ticked, not in the shadow of guilt, but in the light of understanding. But then, a question arose. If you had been the one to find the will, to discover the truth that could unravel so much, what would you have done? Would you have shared it, knowing the destruction it could bring to someone's life? Or would you have kept it hidden, just as Ambrose had once done, letting the burden of that secret fester quietly in the background, unseen by the world? It's a question that lingers long after the story ends. What would you have chosen? Would you have acted, knowing the consequences? Or would you have kept silent, protecting what little peace remained? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, as your perspective can add a whole new layer to this mystery, turning it into a conversation that unravels even more complexities. And if this story has stirred something in you, whether it's curiosity, a sense of justice, or perhaps even a chill down your spine, why not consider subscribing for more tales like this? Share it with a friend who thrives on a good mystery, one that twists and turns with each passing moment, drawing you deeper into the world of secrets, truth, and hidden lives. Until next time, remember to stay inquisitive, stay thoughtful, and never ignore the ticking of something hidden. There's always more beneath the surface than meets the eye.